Water goes into the pot at a full boil, and a mesh pyramid goes in right behind it. And what comes out the other side is not just tea. It is tea carrying billions of plastic particles too small for the eye to catch. I held one of those pyramid bags up to the kitchen light once, turned it over in my fingers, the way I used to turn over a jar before it went on my grandmother's shelf, and thought, this is not paper, this is not cotton. This is a plastic sachet dressed up to look like a farmhouse. There is a number behind that claim, a real one, from a study out of McGill University in 2019. And I am going to give you the shape of it before I give you all of it. Because the full number is the kind of thing you need to hear once you understand what you are actually steeping. That is the first thing I am setting aside for you. The second is this. By the end of what I'm about to tell you, I am going to hand you the exact way I brew now. The one that costs less, tastes cleaner, and does not involve boiling plastic in a cup at all. So here is my first question for you, and I want you to actually answer it in the comments before you keep going. When you buy the fancier tea, the kind in the silky triangle sachet instead of the flat paper square, do you ever stop and ask what that triangle is actually made of? Or do you trust that if it costs more, it must be better? This is what the label shows, most of the time. Nylon, or a form of polyethylene terephthalate, sometimes dressed up under a name like silken or biodegradable mesh. Read that again. A tea bag, something you are told to submerge in boiling water for several minutes, made from the same family of plastic as a soda bottle or a stocking. My grandmother kept a rule for the cellar. If she could not say plainly what was inside a jar, it did not go on her shelf, full stop, no exceptions made for a pretty label or a fashionable name. A plastic mesh pyramid dressed up as an artisan tea sachet would not have made it past her door, and she would not have needed a study to tell her why. Boiling water is not gentle on plastic. Heat accelerates the breakdown of those polymer strands, and a 5-minute steep at near boiling temperature is exactly the kind of stress that causes a plastic mesh to shed its structure into whatever liquid surrounds it. That McGill study I mentioned found that a single plastic tea bag, steeped the ordinary way any of us would steep it, released billions of microplastic particles and billions more, even smaller nanoplastic particles into that one cup. Billions. From one bag, in one cup. That is not a rounding error, and that is not a marketing exaggeration. That is what happens when you ask heat and plastic to sit together in the same closed space. And here is where it gets interesting, because it is not only the plastic itself that ends up in your cup. Heat can also release other substances associated with the plastic that were never intended to end up in a beverage at all. Things researchers refer to as non-intentionally added substances, riding along with the particles themselves. I am not going to tell you a company is lying about what is in that bag, because most labels never claim the bag itself was food. I am telling you that when you steep it at a boil for several minutes, some of what makes up that bag is not staying behind in the compost. I think about my neighbour's kitchen back home more than almost any other kitchen I ever stood in, because she was the one who taught most of the young women in our district how to make a proper cup of tea from the herbs she dried on strings above her stove. Chamomile, mint, whatever had come in that season. There was no bag in her kitchen, not once, not ever. Tea was leaves and hot water and a strainer she had owned longer than some of us had been alive, and it never occurred to anyone at her table to ask what the container was made of, because the container was metal, and the leaves were leaves. That is not nostalgia. That is the entire argument this video is making, just lived out in one specific kitchen, on one specific stovetop, years before anyone had a name for a microplastic. Now, I want to be fair about something, because a fair fight earns more trust than a one-sided one. Not every fancy sachet is plastic. Some brands have shifted to a plant-based material called polylactic acid, and they market it as compostable, biodegradable, a green alternative to the mesh. Here is the part that gets left off the front of the box. Polylactic acid generally requires industrial composting conditions, sustained heat, and specific microbial activity to actually break down. Sitting in a home compost bin, or worse, steeped once and thrown in a regular trash bin, it very often behaves almost exactly like the plastic it was meant to replace. I am not accusing anyone of lying about what the material is. I am telling you that plant-based and breaks down in your yard are two very different promises, and the label usually only makes the first one. Have you ever noticed a bitter, almost metallic aftertaste in a cup of bagged tea that you assumed was just the tannins, just the nature of a strong steep? Ask yourself that the next time you make one, because some of what you are tasting may not be the tea leaf at all. It may be the packaging itself, breaking down under heat, contributing a flavour that has nothing to do with the plant you thought you were drinking. If you are the kind of person who turns a jar around to read the back before you ever look at the front, you already know where this is going next. And I would rather have you along for that part of the conversation than have you miss it. So stay close. Let's talk about what loose leaf actually costs you, because this is where the story stops being about plastic and starts being about your wallet. Premium bagged tea is priced by the piece. A small paper or mesh container holding a modest pinch of leaf, individually wrapped, individually stapled, individually printed with a brand name, and every one of those steps adds to what you pay per cup. Bulk loose-leaf tea, bought from a proper tea merchant rather than a supermarket display, is priced by weight. And once you strip away the packaging, the staple, and the marketing sleeve, you are paying almost entirely for the leaf itself rather than the container it arrived in. There is something else bagged tea rarely tells you, and it matters more than the price tag. A quality whole leaf can be steeped more than once. The leaf unfurls slowly, releases its character in layers, and a second or even a third infusion of the same leaves will still give you a full, flavourful cup, which effectively cuts your cost per cup by half or more, depending on how many infusions you get out of it. A bagged tea, crushed into dust and fannings to fit inside that little sachet, gives you almost everything it has in the first steep, and very little on the second, because there is simply less leaf structure left to give. The first time I walked into an English grocery store after I left my community, I stood in the tea aisle so long that a young man stocking shelves finally asked if I was lost. I was not lost. I was looking at row after row of boxes, each one holding a dozen or 2 dozen small paper pyramids, and doing the arithmetic in my head, the same way I had once done arithmetic over flour and sugar for a wedding cake. How much of this box is actually tea, and how much of it is just paper, staples, and a printed name? The answer, once I learned to do that math properly, changed how I have bought tea ever since. Loose leaf also means less waste leaving your house every week. No individual wrappers, no staples, no tag strings, no cellophane over wrap. Just leaves that go into a compost pile or a green bin as they are, the way a garden clipping would. That is not a small thing if you are the kind of person who already separates your recycling and feels a small twinge every time you throw away another little paper envelope that held 4 grams of tea and 8 grams of packaging. So how do you actually make the switch without turning your kitchen counter into more work than it is worth? You do not need anything elaborate. A simple stainless steel infuser basket or a glass teapot with a built-in strainer will do everything a bag ever did, except it is reusable for years, easy to rinse clean, and leaves the leaf itself room to expand fully in the water instead of being crushed against a mesh wall. That unrestricted expansion matters more than people realize. A leaf that can fully unfurl releases its complex compounds gradually and completely, where a leaf trapped tightly inside a small bag mostly just steeps the dust that's settled to the bottom of the processing bin. There is a particular Sunday dinner I still think about at a bishop's wife's table, where the tea came out in a plain brown pot with a strainer built into the spout, and every person at that table knew without being told that you let it sit a certain number of minutes before you poured, and that you never poured the last portion, because that was where the sediment settled. Nobody had a timer. Nobody needed one. It was knowledge passed down the same way bread baking was passed down, hand to hand, at that same table, generation after generation. That is really the only technical skill you need to bring across. A rough sense of water temperature and timing, because different leaves want different treatment. Delicate green leaves want water well below a full boil and a shorter steep, or they turn bitter and grassy. Black leaves and most herbal blends can handle a full boil and a longer steep without complaint. That distinction alone, learned once, does more for your cup than any amount of money spent on packaging design ever will. Now, I want to be fair one more time, because I promised you honesty rather than a sales pitch. Loose leaf does ask a little more of you than a bag does. You do need an infuser, however simple, and you do need to rinse it out after each use, rather than simply lifting a bag by its string and tossing it. Depending on where you live, a good tea merchant selling proper bulk leaf may be harder to find than a supermarket aisle full of boxed sachets. And if that is your situation, mail order is a reasonable bridge, even if it is not quite the same as standing over an open tin and smelling the leaf before you buy it. None of that erases the case I have made here. It just means the switch takes a small adjustment, not a miracle. If removing daily plastic exposure from something you drink every single morning matters to you, that adjustment is a very small price. My grandmother never had a name for a microplastic, and she never needed one, because her rule was simpler than any laboratory could make it. If she could not say plainly what was in the jar, it did not go on the shelf. A plastic mesh pyramid, steeped in boiling water and marketed as a premium indulgence, would never have passed that test. And neither should it pass yours. So here is your homework, if you want it. Look at the box of tea in your own cupboard right now, not later, right now, and read what the bag itself is made of, not just what is inside it. Then tell me in one word what you found. Paper, plastic, or something you had to look up. That number I promised you at the start, the billions of particles in a single cup from a single bag, that is not a scare tactic. That is a measured finding. And it is the reason I do not reach for that pyramid sachet anymore. And the answer I promised you, the thing that replaces it, is sitting in a plain tin on my counter right now. Loose leaf, a metal infuser, and water heated to whatever that particular leaf actually asks for. That is the whole trade. Less plastic, Less cost, more tea. Read that again, and then go check your own cupboard.